If you see an incoming phone call and feel instant anxiety even from people you love, you're not antisocial or rude. Psychology reveals that phone call anxiety is connected to how your brain processes unstructured social interaction, and people who prefer text over calls are often more thoughtful communicators, not worse ones. Let's talk about something that makes you feel both relieved and guilty. You hate phone calls. Not just dislike them, you genuinely dread them. When your phone rings, your heart rate spikes. You stare at the screen, watching it ring, calculating whether you absolutely have to answer. Even calls from friends and family trigger anxiety. You let it go to voicemail, then spend 20 minutes psyching yourself up to listen to the voicemail, and another hour composing the perfect text response explaining why you can't talk right now. People don't understand this. They say just pick up the phone. It's easier to talk than text. Why are you being so difficult? But here's what psychology and communication research reveal. Your phone anxiety isn't antisocial behavior or technological dysfunction. It's a response to the specific cognitive and emotional demands that phone calls create. Demands that other forms of communication don't impose. Research from communication psychology shows that phone call anxiety has exploded in recent years, particularly among millennials and Gen Z, but it affects people across all age groups. Studies reveal several factors that make phone calls uniquely stressful compared to other communication forms. First, phone calls are synchronous and demanding. They require immediate real-time response with no time to think or edit. Second, they're unstructured. You don't know what will be discussed, how long it'll take, or what emotional territory you'll have to navigate. Third, they lack visual cues. You can't see facial expressions or body language, making emotional interpretation harder and more effortful. And fourth, they're interruptive. They demand attention immediately, regardless of what you're doing or how you're feeling. Here's what separates phone call haters from phone call lovers. You're someone who processes communication deliberately and thoughtfully. When you text or email, you have time to consider your words, edit for clarity, ensure your tone is right, and respond when you're mentally and emotionally ready. Phone calls strip away all of these buffers. You're forced to respond instantly, without preparation, while simultaneously managing your own emotional state, interpreting the other person's tone without visual cues, and navigating an unpredictable conversation flow. For people who think quickly on their feet and process socially in real time, this is fine. For people who process deeply and prefer to craft their responses, this is cognitive and emotional overload. Let's talk about the performance pressure that phone calls create. Research shows that phone anxiety is often rooted in what's called evaluation apprehension, the fear of being judged negatively during the interaction. On a phone call, there's no time to edit your awkward phrasing, no way to delete a stupid comment, no opportunity to reconsider before hitting send. Every word comes out in real time, unfiltered. If you stumble over words, if you say something unclear, if you have an awkward silence, it's all happening live, and you can't take it back. For perfectionists or people with social anxiety, this creates paralyzing pressure. Text communication removes this pressure, because you can revise before sending. Here's the neurodivergent component that explains so much phone anxiety. For people with ADHD, phone calls are nightmares because they require sustained attention without any external structure. You can't skim a phone call like you can skim a text. You can't go back and reread what was said. If your attention drifts for 10 seconds, you've lost the thread of conversation. For people on the autism spectrum, phone calls remove the visual information many rely on to interpret communication: facial expressions, gestures, context clues. You're trying to decode tone of voice alone, which is much harder and more anxiety for people with auditory processing issues. Phone calls are exhausting because you're straining to hear and decode words through imperfect audio quality while managing background noise. Research on introverts reveals another key factor. Introverts find phone calls particularly draining because they're intense, focused social interaction with no breaks. In person, you can use body language to signal you need a moment. You can look away briefly. You can share comfortable silence. On the phone, every moment of silence feels awkward and must be filled. You're on for the entire duration with no respite. Studies show that introverts need time alone to recharge after social interaction, and phone calls provide no gradual on-ramp or off-ramp there, 0 to 60 immediately, then abrupt disconnection. This violates the introvert nervous system's need for gradual social and good engagement. Let's address the boundary violation that phone calls represent. When someone calls you, they're essentially saying, "Stop what you're doing right now and give me your full attention immediately." This is incredibly presumptuous. You might be in the middle of focused work, in a bad mood, dealing with something stressful, or simply not in a headspace to perform socially, but the phone rings, and you're expected to switch instantly into conversation mode. Text respects boundaries. It allows asynchronous communication where both parties respond when ready. Phone calls demand synchronous attention regardless of readiness. Your phone anxiety might be a healthy boundary response to this intrusion. Here's what people don't understand. You're not avoiding conversation, you're avoiding unstructured, high-pressure, real-time verbal performance. Research shows that people with phone anxiety often have rich, deep conversations via text, email, or in-person meetings they can prepare for. The problem isn't communication itself. It's the specific format of phone calls. You prefer communication that allows for thoughtfulness over immediacy, clarity over spontaneity, and consent over interruption. These aren't inferior values, they're different communication priorities. Studies on communication preferences reveal generational and cultural shifts. Older generations, who grew up with phones as the primary distance communication tool, develop comfort with phone calls and see them as normal, efficient, and personal. Younger generations, who grew up with multiple communication options, see phone calls as unnecessarily invasive and inefficient. Why call when you could text the same information in 30 seconds without the small talk, awkward pauses, and unclear ending? This isn't antisocial, it's optimization. You've identified that most information can be conveyed more efficiently through text, reserving phone calls for truly complex or urgent situations. Let's talk about the specific anxieties phone calls trigger. First, the when will this end? Anxiety phone calls have no defined endpoint. You don't know if this will be 5 minutes or 50 seconds or what do they want. Anxiety, you often don't know why someone is calling, so you can't prepare, mentally or emotionally. Third, the I can't multitask anxiety, unlike text where you can think while responding. Phone calls demand full attention. Fourth, the awkward ending anxiety. How do you politely end the call without seeming rude? Fifth, the tone misinterpretation anxiety without visual cues. You're constantly wondering if they sound annoyed, if you sound weird, if there's tension you're missing. Research on workplace communication shows that the shift from phone to email, Slack, text has actually improved productivity and reduced stress for many workers. Phone calls interrupt flow states, create scheduling challenges, and often lack documentation. Written communication allows people to work according to their own rhythms, maintain focus, and have records of decisions and information. Your preference for written communication isn't laziness, it's alignment with modern work practices that value asynchronous, documented, thoughtful exchange over immediate, undocumented, pressured conversation. Here's the perfectionism component. If you're someone who carefully crafts your words, who values precision and clarity, who hates being misunderstood, phone calls are your nightmare. You can't edit, you can't clarify before sending, you can't ensure your message is exactly what you meant. Research shows that perfectionists experience higher phone anxiety because the medium doesn't allow for the control and refinement they need to feel comfortable. Text gives you your phone avoidance is selfish, that you're prioritizing your comfort over their preference. But consider this. Why is their preference for calling more valid than your preference for texting? Why should you have to endure anxiety phone calls to make them comfortable, but they don't have to accommodate your communication preferences? This asymmetry reveals a bias toward traditional communication methods as more legitimate. Even when research shows that communication effectiveness depends on fit between method and communicators, not on method alone. Studies on anxiety disorders show that phone anxiety often coexists with social anxiety, but they're not identical. You can have phone anxiety without general social anxiety. You might be perfectly comfortable in planned face-to-face interactions but dread phone calls specifically. This is because phone calls combine the worst aspects of social interaction: real-time performance pressure without the reassurance of visual feedback. It's social anxiety and